Hi everyone, Joseph Koensgen here. Welcome back to my art studio. In this video, I want to show you how I paint some of the frosty pine branches that I have as the background for the painting I've got on the easel behind me here. I'm going to focus on one section of the branch so that I can go into a lot more detail about how I create the final look for all of these pine needles covered in frost. And then in my next video, I'll show you how I paint the blue jay that's perched on one of these branches. So with that, let's get to the paint and brushes that I'm using. So the colors I've got today are Mars Black, Titanium White, Prussian Blue, Raw Umber, Cadmium Yellow Light, Yellow Oxide, and Cadmium Red Light. And for my brushes, I'm going to use a number 8 Filbert and a number 12 Filbert. And then I'm also going to use a round number 1, a round number 2, and a round number 4. I'll start with a bluish gray for the background, some titanium white, a bit of my Mars Black, some of the Prussian Blue, and a bit of the Raw Umber. I don't want it to be too dark, but dark enough to really show all the frosty pine needles and snow that's in the painting. So first, I'll show you the simple gray background that I want to have behind all these branches, filling out most of the painting with this color. I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap in the top right corner so I can build a slight gradient up there. As well, this painting is 10 by 24 inches. A nice horizontal size that I really like to use for paintings like this. I like that with this kind of shape, the branch can extend all the way across the length of the painting, and I can really show off a lot more of those details and different elements within this branch. Then I can lighten this color up for my next color in the gradient by adding just a little bit more titanium white. Then I can fill in that next layer in the top right of the painting. It's not that much lighter than the color I had before because I don't want the gradient to be too strong. Just keeping that gradient a little bit more gentle and a little bit more smooth. And then I can use that same color to do a little bit of dry brushing here. And what I want to do is just bring some of that color down into the darker color below it, just to soften that hard edge between these two colors. And the way I'm doing this is just with very little paint on the brush, just kind of dabbing the paint on and scrubbing it around in a very thin layer, just to soften that edge, bringing that paint down thinner and thinner as I get lower and lower to create that nice smooth gradient. Then I can go a little bit lighter still with some more white. And this is going to be for the brightest color in this gradient. And then I can fill in that last section at the top. I like to do this with these simple backgrounds because I find it helps give just a little bit of a direction of light. This scene is an overcast day, so the light is basically top down, but this will emphasize that just a little bit more. Then I can soften that edge like I did on that previous layer. Just a little bit of dry brushing, bringing some of that color down and just softening it into that darker color. Okay, I think that looks good. A nice simple bluish gray background with a very slight gradient. It should be perfect for all these frosty branches and eventually the blue jay that I will paint in there. Now I'm going to mix up a slightly darker and a little bit bluer version of that background color. This will be for the block in of the branches. So I'll start with a slightly darker gray, and then mix in some Prussian blue, and I'll mix in a little bit more than I did from before. And then just a touch of raw umber just to warm it up slightly. Then I can start loosely blocking in where all the branches are going to be. This isn't going to be super refined at the moment. I just want to get a general shape and placement of the branches. And I like to start this way so that I can get a good sense of the whole painting right at the beginning. If something needs to be moved around, it's much easier to do at this stage. And this mid-range value is going to be a good base for when I start to fill in all the pine needles. It should give me lots of room to build up both the shadows and the highlights on either side of this value. So I'll just start with some simple shapes, just getting the placement of each branch in the right spot. I am going to leave a little bit of a gap here for where the blue jay is supposed to go because I'm not exactly sure where I'm going to place it, but I will cover that in the next video that I do about the blue jay. And I am leaving some pretty large spaces here, but those are going to be filled with some of the clumps of snow that are on the branches and the frosty pine needles and all the lighter highlights that are going to go on all these branches. Right now I want to get the basic shape of some of these darker regions and shadow areas just to get an overall sense of the entire branch. And then I can slide it over to the other side of the painting. And this is the part that I'm going to focus on for this video so that I can get a bit more into the process of how I bring this to life. All the branches in this painting are going to be done in the exact same way, and as we'll see, it's going to get quite repetitive with painting all these needles in. So I think it'll be more helpful if I show this section in much greater detail rather than just glossing over the entire painting and this entire large branch. Then I can mix up a light gray for some of the snow that's on the branches, just a touch of the Mars black, and just a touch of the Prussian blue so it matches the tone of the rest of the painting. Then I can block in the snow that's on the branches. I chose this background because I like the way that the snow kind of breaks up the background from it just being all pine needles. I also think it gives it a little bit more of a cool wintry feel, which is what I was wanting for this painting. So I'll just place all these clumps of snow in the spaces that I left for them. And even with just a bit of the snow in here already, it's really starting to come together. This is one of the reasons I like to start my paintings with a very simple and rough block in. This way, when I'm right at the beginning, I can get a good feel for my entire painting, and I can make sure that my composition is on the right track for how I want it to look. Okay, that's great. I've got the branches and the snow blocked in, and I really like the feel this painting already has. Okay, now I can take that same color I used for blocking these in and start to bring out some of the individual pine needles. For this, I'm using my round number 2 brush. This is still going to be a bit of a blocking in stage as I'm going to refine both some of the needles but also the overall branch shape. I just want to get the direction of the pine needles established and fill in some of those areas where I want the branches to be a bit more full. Starting to be a little bit more precise and planning out where all these needles are going to be, just to make sure that they have the right look and feel for the type of tree that I'm painting. Then just continuing on, and I'm not painting the full length of each pine needle here. Since each one is mostly frost at the end, I can do that with a lighter color next, where I'll establish more of the final shape that each pine needle is going to have. So I'll establish more of these pine needles, paying attention to the shape and the direction, following along my reference photos, and just building a really good base for all of the colors and the details and the layers that I'll paint on top of this one. Now onto these lower branches. These are hanging down a little bit from the weight of the snow, so they're pointing a bit more towards the ground and a little bit more bunched together. This is where it becomes important to look closely at the reference photo you're using to see how things like snow or the direction of the branch affects the shapes of the needles. I'm not necessarily looking for it to be an exact copy, but close enough so that it feels real. And I'm not going straight into filling it out all in one go. I'm adding some needles, then measuring that against the other branches and adding some more where they need it. I want to build it up slowly so that I can make sure that all the pine needles and branches have roughly the same shape and length. This is something I'll do throughout the entire painting, gauging the size and the shape of each branch and pine needle to make sure that they all look like they're part of the same tree. Okay, now that's starting to get there, looking more like branches on a pine tree. And I can just finish with this color by filling out a few more of those different spots. And I think that's a good start for the base color of these pine needles. I'll mix a similar color to the one I did for blocking in the snow. A light gray that's got a little bit of Prussian blue in it. Maybe just a touch more blue and a little bit more black. That should be good. Then I can start in with the part that's going to be the base for all the frost that's on the ends of all the pine needles. And now I'm going to slow down a bit here, as this is where I'll establish the shape of each needle, as well as the structure of each of the branches with their different directions and how loose or clumped together the pine needles are. This is where I'll start to see some shapes come together out of the rough block in. So I'll just be a bit more precise here as I begin detailing all these different pine needles and different branch shapes. Like this one here, where the branch is pointing towards us and you get the needles all radiating out of a center point. I really like the way that looks. It's got a nice dynamic that can work towards giving it that three-dimensional feel. So I'll just continue on with these shapes, making sure to put all the needles in the right spot, and again, paying attention to the shape and size so that they all match each other, so that they all have roughly that same dimension. Building in all those shapes that I wasn't able to define in the blocking in phase. Starting to bring out different branches and thinking about some of the layers that I want to create within all of this that we will get to in the shadows and in some of the other mid-range values later on. So as the painting develops and I'm adding more details here, I can see that I just want to add a little bit more pine needles than I had originally blocked in. I want the branches to be a little bit more densely packed than this, so I'll just keep adding some more, bringing out some more shapes, and just trying to keep it looking nice and realistic. And now onto these lower branches, again following all those needles I had put in before. And I want these to be a little bit more clumped together than I had blocked in at the start. So I'll just add quite a few more. And I can extend some of these a little bit further down just to show some extra layers within some of these branches I can do some of these ones that are in the center of the branch that are pointing directly at us or at just a slight angle. And I'm not always happy with every one that I paint in. And so that is a really great thing about acrylics, is that if I'm not happy with something that I just did and the paint is still wet, I can easily wipe it off and just redo it or retry it in a different way until I get it to the place where I think it looks right. Onto these lower branches now, where the needles are pointing a little bit more down than the other one. And I'm going to make these ones even a little bit more clumped together just because the weight of that snow is kind of pushing this branch downward, kind of bunching all these needles together. And I am starting to feel the repetitiveness a little bit, painting the same kind of pine needle over and over again here. So I'll just be patient and just keep going along with all these details. I love how good these frosty winter scenes can look in a painting. And so all that work and all these layers, in the end, will be totally worth it. These are going to be mostly in shadow, so they won't have as much highlight, and I might try to keep them a little bit softer. Oftentimes what I like to do in paintings like this is that even for branches like these ones down here at the bottom that would be coming off of the main branch and are on the same plane as the other branches, I'll keep them a bit softer and keep the contrast just a little bit lower. That way it kind of pushes them a little bit further back into the distance, and then I can paint the branches that are in front of it with a little bit more contrast to give it some depth. It's not something that I see in my reference photos, but it's something that I often like to exaggerate in my paintings. And in this one in particular, it'll help keep it from being just a jumble of pine needles altogether. I'll be able to show which branches are at the front and which ones are at the back. I think this is starting to look really good. I like all the placement of all my pine needles and the positions of all those different branches. Now I want to darken that mixture just a little bit with some Prussian blue and a little bit of black, maybe a touch of the raw umber, maybe a bit more Prussian blue. I want something that's in between that base color and the lighter color that I just used. And for this I can start using my round number 1 brush. And what I want to do with this color is paint it right in the middle of each pine needle. I want to create a little gradient between the shadow and the highlight. Everything starts out fairly dark at the base of the branch, and then the needles get very light at the ends, both because of the very bright frost and because the ends are catching all that overcast light. So I just want to use this color to help blend my 2 previous colors together. I can also use this to add a few other needles that might be in a little bit more shadow. So I'll just keep going on, overlapping those colors on every single one, and it becomes a bit easier to detail the pine needles now that I've got them all established. Before, it takes quite a bit of time as I follow my reference photos and decide where each one should go. Now it's just a matter of following all those shapes and the direction of the needles. And I'm already starting to see it come together here a little bit. It's not looking quite as flat, and it's starting to look like they're all sticking out from the center of the branch. Down onto the lower branches again, filling out all those spaces for that gradient. And it doesn't take much of this color to create that gradient. I don't want to lose my shadow and lose my highlight, so I'll just try and keep that color just in the center, just to bring those two colors together. And I started overlapping into some of that base color a little bit where there wasn't necessarily any pine needles. I was noticing that it was looking a bit better if more of that base color had a gradient to it than just the pine needles themselves. It seemed to add just a bit more density to the look of the branches, and I find it important for me to pay attention to things like that, adding those elements as the painting develops, and then of course standing back from time to time just to see if it needs anything beyond what I had originally thought. And then just continuing on to these branches to build up that gradient on all these pine needles. And this color is quite subtle, but I really like how it's working for this part of the painting. I like the way it's starting to make those pine needles feel like they're emerging out of the center of the branch. Even just on some of these small ones here, only doing just the tiniest little bit. When I see these frosty scenes out in nature, they really do have this strong monochromatic look to them. And so I really wanted to try and create that in this painting as well, because I also think it's going to help that blue jay really stand out. So even with it being mostly the same color, I can get a ton of interest in each one of these branches by giving it a strong sense of light and shadow. That's where all these small details and the base colors that I'm building up right now will really help when I start to bring in stronger highlights and shadows. Okay, I think that's looking really good so far, and I think it's time to start adding some contrast. For that, I'm going to mix a much darker color with my black and a bit of white, some Prussian blue, but this time I'm going to add a bit of cadmium yellow light to it, just to push it a little bit more into the green. Since this is where the branches will have the least amount of frost on them, we can maybe see a little hint of that color showing through. Then I can start in where the shadow is going to be the darkest, and slowly bringing some of that color down into the light parts. I want to create a gradient just like I did with the previous color, making sure to keep that color mostly towards the base of where each individual shadow starts. And then I can also use this color to bring out some individual pine needles as well. And again, using my round number 1 brush here, it's got a nice sharp point to it for doing all these nice fine lines. And I've got my paint thinned down with just a little bit more water than I normally use, which will really help with all these nice sharp details. And then onto this center branch, starting in the middle and working my way to the edges, putting in some of those pine needles. I'm already liking this so far, but I'm going to try and build it slowly. I found it was easy to get carried away with it because it starts to look really good and I'm tempted to just keep adding more and more shadows. But I don't want to cover too much of those mid-range values where I'd built in all that dynamic before. And it didn't take as much shadow as I would have thought to really bring out that depth. Just a bit in between the spaces and some fine lines for the needles. Some really defined and some not as much. Then back to this one that's facing us. Dark in the middle and radiating out to the edges. Again, not overdoing it and just having it mostly dark and right in the center. Then for some of these parts behind this one, I can use a bit more of this color to create a darker shadow around it, and that'll help the branch that's facing us stand out just a little bit more. So one of the main reasons I do my shadows now after all the mid-range values, instead of starting with the darks and then doing all the lighter values on top, is that the pine needles that are showing through some of the frost are much easier and much faster to paint at this stage. And I can just get a bit closer here and show some of the individual needles that I'm putting in, painting them directly on top of these right in the center, so I'll still have some lighter color around them. When I've done frosty pine branches like this before, I would start with the darkest color and then put the frost all the way around each individual pine needle. It was a bit tedious and really time consuming, and I wasn't always entirely happy with the result. And a lot of the time I would end up having to go over them again anyways. It's also a bit easier to pull out different shapes and shadows that I'm noticing along the way. And a lot of what I'm doing here is just paying attention to the shapes I had put down before, and then using the shadow color to try and create those layers of branches, making it look like it's one in front of the other. Keeping it a bit darker for the branches that are lower and underneath the others. Then onto these top branches here, keeping it mostly in the middle, and then bringing some of that color down at the bottom to create that shadow and just give it a little bit of a sense of the direction of light. At the top here, I can be a little bit lighter with my brushwork. This is where most of the highlight is going to be, so I don't want it to be quite as dark. Okay, that looks great. I love the contrast it's brought out in all these branches. And so I'll just go around and make a few more adjustments here and there, and I think that should be good. Now I want to make a darker reddish brown, starting with my cadmium red light and a bit of yellow oxide, some black and some white. Maybe a bit more of those colors, just a bit darker. Okay, that should be good. I'm just going to put a little bit of this reddish brown at the ends and maybe in the center of some of the branches, so we get just a little hint of seeing some of that tree branch color. I also think that this helps to just ever so slightly break up that very monochromatic color palette that I have for this entire painting. So I'll just do a little bit more here and there, not too much, and I think that looks good. Now I'm going to take just titanium white for the brightest highlight. And this is the most exciting part, where we get to see it really turn into that frosty winter scene. So I'm just going to be adding the white to just the ends of the needles. I don't want to go too far down and cover all that work we did before. I just want to continue on with that gradient that we had created, going from our dark shadow all the way to our brightest highlight. But having said that, I will be highlighting the ones on the top that are catching the light a little bit more than the ones at the bottom. It wasn't quite like that in my reference photos, but I'm going to exaggerate that a bit so we do get that stronger sense of light. And as you can see for this final highlight layer, I'm just dabbing the paint on to give it a kind of fuzzy look. When I look at frosty branches in nature, all those tiny little ice crystals create all these little jagged and fuzzy lines, so I want to do my best to create that uneven texture by just kind of dotting the paint on to the ends of all these needles. It's definitely going to be a bit tedious, but it should add a lot of realism to the painting. So as you can see, for the ones pointing downward, I'm not adding nearly as much highlight as I did for the ones at the top. Then I can bring out more of these layers that I defined with my shadow color by just highlighting the ends of all these pine needles. Then a bit more on the sides here, and I'm just following all of the pine needles I had painted in before and simply deciding how much highlight I think I need for each one. And that'll just depend on the way it's facing and how much light I think it's getting. And even with just a little bit of highlight on here so far, I'm really liking the way this is looking. And with this highlight, I can now start to see that really great dynamic of all these needles that are crisscrossing in front of each other and all these great little shapes that are developing along the way. Adding all these final highlights is always such a satisfying part of painting these kinds of frosty branches. It really starts to bring the scene to life. Now onto these branches here, and it is just more of the same, dabbing that paint onto the end of each pine needle. And here with all these ones that are just under the snow and are also pointing towards us, they'll have most of the highlight on them. The weight of the snow pushing down on these branches is giving some unique shapes to work with here, so I'll just make sure that I'm keeping with the same idea of having strong highlights at the top and a lot less towards the bottom. Then up the side of this branch, dabbing that paint onto the end of each pine needle. This one has some different layers to it that I'm starting to notice. Looking at it from the side like this, it's got this top, middle, and bottom section to it, and it almost looks like opening the pages of a book. So I'll just make sure to highlight that properly with different amounts of white and getting that nice separation of those layers. For some of these branches that are underneath this one and a little bit further back, I'll keep the highlights a little bit softer and down towards the bottom of the branch hardly any at all. That should help the ones in front of them stand out just a little bit more. Then onto this one, and I'll just keep doing the same thing. All these little pine needles just sticking out from underneath this snow. And I might highlight this branch a little bit more than the other one. Especially on this outer edge here where the needles are quite clumped together from the snow pushing down on them. And then getting progressively darker with less and less highlight as I get to the underside of the branch. Just a little bit here and there, very lightly. This will really help with that direction of light and give it that nice three-dimensional look. And then just a little bit on the very ends of these ones right at the bottom. For these ones here that are under all these other branches and in shadow and a bit further away, I'm just going to do a few of these pine needles just on the very ends like I had done on some of the other ones. This will kind of help keep them a bit further away and make it look like they're in shadow and not catching very much light. Like I had mentioned before, I want to have a few branches appear a bit further away, even though they are attached to the main branch and on the same plane as all the others. So I'll keep these ones a bit softer and lighter so that they appear a little bit more behind the ones in front of it. So I'm still using just titanium white here, but I'm putting it on a bit softer, almost like in a dry brushing way so that the white isn't as intense. It will make them look further away, even within the foreground. Now that all those highlights are in there, I really like the way this looks. I love how all those layers came together in the end. There's lots of really great shapes within those shadows and in those highlights. The last thing to do on the branches is the snow. So I'll start with that same gray mixture that's got just a tiny bit of Prussian blue in it. I'll just use that color right at the bottom here. I don't want it to be too dark, but this will be the darkest shadow color for the snow. And I'll put it just along that bottom edge. Then I can lighten that up with just a little bit of titanium white. And I'll just build on that first dark layer, starting to introduce some shapes and textures to the snow. Still just going along the bottom here. I don't have to fill out the rest of the snow at the top just yet, until I get into some of the next lightest colors. And I'll do that so I can keep the shadows that are at the tops of these clumps of snow quite a bit lighter than the shadows at the bottom. Then the next lightest color, and now I can start to be a little bit more intentional with that snow detail. The texture I'm going for here is the kind where the snow gently accumulates on the branches. So I'm just trying to create some subtle little bumps and ridges and give it a bit of structure. I'll keep my brush moving around fairly quickly. I don't want it to look like a super repetitive pattern, so I'll keep it a bit random, but still with some uniform shapes. I can start to fill in the rest of the snow at the top now that I'm into my lighter color. Then the same for this other one. And as I'm working, I'll kind of let some shapes appear out of the randomness of my brushwork. And I find that really helps keep it from being too uniform as I try to give it this nice natural look. And then a bit lighter again by adding some more titanium white. Now I can cover most of the top with this lighter color, bringing out even more texture as it gets lighter and lighter, following some of those same shapes that I put in before. And with my brushwork, I'm also trying to keep everything soft here. I don't want a lot of hard edges in the texture of the snow. I kind of want everything to blend together just a little bit. So it's a bit of dry brushing and not a ton of pressure with the brush to make sure that I keep all those bumps and ridges from standing out too much. I want the detail in this snow to be nice and subtle. And then same for this snow here, trying to bring out that nice soft texture of this gently fallen snow. Just following those same patterns and little ridges, making sure everything is nice and filled in and covered for my final highlight layer. Now I can take just titanium white and thin it out with a bit of water, and I'll just start right at the top and work my way down, bringing out some of these textures as I try and create that overall rounded shape, where the highlights nicely roll off into those subtle shadows. And with this final highlight, it doesn't take a lot to bring it to that lightest color. Again, I don't want to get too carried away and cover everything I just did. I want to get mostly just the top and then some of the small bumps and ridges on the side. It's very subtle, but when I look at snow in nature, there isn't a lot of dynamic to the snowy bits on these overcast days. So I want it to be just enough to show some shape, but also fit the lighting of the entire scene. Okay, I think that looks great. I'll just make sure everything looks right, touch up a few different spots here and there. Just make sure all my highlights are nice and bright. And I think I've got these branches done. I really like the way this has turned out. It's got this great ethereal feel to it, and a really nice dynamic of all these different branches and frosty pine needles. And with this part all done, I can go on and complete the rest of the background. So I'll just quickly go over the rest of the painting. I'm doing the exact same process that I did before, starting with my base colors, my mid-range values, and creating all those little gradients on each pine needle. Then bringing out that contrast and shadows with my darker color, and keeping the whole thing in that same monochromatic gray with that slight bluish color to it. Again, following all those shapes and trying to build in some separation, creating those layers between the different branches for some that are closer or further away. Then with all the bright highlights, making sure to keep that fuzzy texture for the frost on each one of these pine needles. This kind of idea can certainly take a lot of patience with how repetitive it is, but the end result is definitely worth it. And I just like how striking these scenes can be. It's going to be the perfect setting for the blue jay that I'm going to paint in here. So with some final adjustments and a few more details, I think I can call this background finished. I love the way this whole background turned out. All those really great shapes and shadows, the snow, and then especially all those pine needles covered in frost. You can join me in my next video where I'll show you how I paint the blue jay that will complete this scene. I really appreciate you following along. Thank you so much for watching.